Roy never finished high school. He was a little bit of a rebel. His parents, his father in particular, was a college graduate. Roy was born in 1875, and he actually ran away from home a few times. His father was in the woman's millinery hat and glove business, and he was acting as their traveling salesman for a while. And then he ran away from home and acted as a traveling salesman for a coffee company in Boston, which is a very amusing story. He then got interested in the coffee business, and he actually went to Costa Rica for 2 or 3 years learning the coffee business, and he bought a plantation. While all this is going on, his mother, who is still in Ohio, her best friend, Margaret Peake, traveled to Chicago and became a Baha'i under the teachings of Kahirullah. Margaret Peake writes to her best friend, Roy's mother, and sends her an early translation of the Hidden Words, which was really a very poor translation, but it was a translation. And with that, Roy's mother becomes a Baha'i in 1898 or 1899. So she's considered to be the second Baha'i in the state of Ohio. She then starts writing to her son Roy about Abdu'l-Baha and the Baha'i faith, even though they have very limited knowledge of it, and Kahirullah really has a lot of misinformation about the faith. Roy's mother is sharing it with Roy. When Roy left Costa Rica, he then moved to New York City to become engaged in the green coffee business, and his parents came to visit. And when they visited, they took him to meet every Baha'i in New York City. They went to meetings, they went to every activity that they could find, because Roy's mother was a devoted Baha'i, and she wanted to interact with all these New York City Baha'is, and she didn't want to go with just her husband. She took Roy with her, coffee importer. I also didn't tell you he was on the board of the coffee merchants, which set up the first arbitration board, which is the coffee importers would sometimes claim that the coffee beans were from one plantation and it was really from another. So they're trying to sell cheaper beans at a higher price. And Roy and people would get into physical fights and kill each other over it. It was very bad. So Roy and a number of other members of the green coffee merchants formed this organization, and the arbitration board would arbitrate these disputes. Roy would act as a taster because his sense of taste was so acute, he could tell which plantation the beans came from. It's a process called cupping, where they have all these different cups, and you might taste 20 or 30 different cups, and he would be able to tell which plantation the beans were from. So this arbitration board, which he was one of 17 members of, helped settle a lot of these disputes in a peaceable fashion so people wouldn't be killing themselves. When the stock market crashed in 1929, people were still buying coffee. They hadn't stopped doing that. There were coffee lines and all that. So his business actually didn't really crash. He was still able to import coffee, and it may have been a little bit less, but he was still profitable, because even if people couldn't buy food or rent or anything else, they would still buy a cup of coffee. So in 1930, he liked to go camping, and he would take trips at various times to go hiking in the woods and camping. And in 1930, he took his first trip up to Maine, to Stoneham, to Oxford County, and he called it going to Gilead. Gilead's a biblical reference. He called the trip going to Gilead. And then year after year, he would spend more time there. And he kept a diary, so I could tell you he spent 2 weeks this year, 3 weeks the next year, 3 months another year. He kept a diary of going up to Maine. Since property prices had dropped down bottom level because of the Depression, he started buying property there. And he started buying property in 1931. I have all the deeds of his land sales. So his neighbors, people like Charles Hart, Zenon Fontaine, There were two others. He bought property from them until he acquired a large property on the mountainside and some other property too. When he was on pilgrimage in 1907, he had complained of some stomach complaints to Abdu'l-Baha, and Abdu'l-Baha suggested to him that goat milk would be a perfect remedy for his stomach ills. So in Teaneck, where he had his initial properties, he had a small goat herd. When he went to Maine, he had a bigger goat herd, and at times he had more than 300 goats. During the summertime, he might have 2,000 or 3,000 visitors, and his records show that he might make 600 gallons of goat milk ice cream. He had local youth mow the hay, take care. He also had cattle, he had some dogs, he had some other animals, and he actually built 3 structures on the mountain. One was the chalet that he lived in, one was a barn, and then there's a third structure which was like an ice house, but it held other, things. So he actually had 3 structures on the mountain. The barn was twice as big as the chalet. In this large barn that he had, he installed in the roof several very large fans, like 10, 12-foot diameter fans, because there are lots of animals in there, so they were venting it in the summertime, so he put some big fans in. One of his neighbors, who did not like him very much, thought that he was a spy and that he was reporting on the ship travels in the Atlantic so that the German U-boats could fire on them. And you may not know that there are actually German U-boats on some of the rivers in Maine. The German U-boats actually went into some of the rivers, the Penobscot.
Wow, I didn't know that.
There were actually German U-boats that were shot down okay. So this neighbor claimed that Roy, 100 miles inland, was watching the Atlantic for shipping and reporting as U-boats could get them.
Oh my gosh.
The report eventually went to the FBI. With the Freedom of Information Act, I was able to read the FBI transcript.
Oh.
So it's available if you know how to access those things, which
wow.
effort, but I was able to do it. And what happened is that the FBI had to investigate this because of the nature of the complaint. And they went to Roy's house and they started measuring the barn because this person claimed that that's where he was transmitting messages. It was just the fans in the ceiling, but that was his secret transmitter. So they measured the barn and decided that there was a secret room in the barn, the FBI. They took the barn apart. They dismantled it. There was no secret room. Roy had to rebuild the barn.
Yeah.
The other reason this person raised the alarm is because Roy kept getting messages from overseas, because he would be the communicator for Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi, or at that time Shoghi Effendi. So he would get cables, and one of the people in his service would have to go and respond to cables and all that. And then mail would be sent from New York up to him. So there's a large amount of correspondence. So this neighbor also thought that this had to be something evil because of this of international bullying and why. Yeah. He would get visitors from local people and from all over, even though it was remote and hard to get to because there wasn't really good transportation then. His summer, information would be some summers he had 3,000 to 4,000 visitors.
Wow, amazing.
People who climbed the mountain, that he lived on, would always stop at his house to get some lemonade or something to drink, when they were going up and down the mountain. He was a very hospitable person.
He was a servant to the hikers too. Yeah. Well,
people would come, dignitaries would come to visit him in fancy cars, and they would leave their chauffeur at the car while they were talking to Roy. So Roy would excuse himself go down to the car, talk to the chauffeur, and bring him up to sit with everybody else. He would not allow the chauffeur of the rich people's cars to sit by themselves. He would always invite them to join the discussion. He was very interesting.